theirs was an age of bronze.
Hello and welcome to HistoryFlights, your monthly-ish tour of contemporary, historical, and fictional politics through video games by me, DC Shepard. Today, while playing Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, Assassin's Creed Odyssey's Discovery Tour, and Troy, a Total War saga, I'll be reviewing Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey as a movie. Quoting from the screenplay, so spoilers ahead, as a contemporary American interpretation of a 2.5 millennia plus year-old myth that would have been ancient and heavily retold even to Homer, keep those air quotes in mind, how it personally resonated with me, and most crucially as a product of a collapsing world heavily reliant on trade with parallels between the Bronze Age and today. I first started writing this script on July 22nd, 2026, only a few hours after seeing this 3-hour cyclops at my local Alamo Drafthouse. Though the big show there is fantastic, and the insane demand meant it took almost a week after release for me to find a seat with my nose not pressed up against the screen, it unfortunately is no IMAX. So, it took me another couple weeks to find time to go see that version in the 4th row with friends on August 3rd, and without direct comparison, it's difficult to tell the IMAX version's visual upgrades. Which, as I pointed out in my initial impressions of The Odyssey with my friend Kevin on Sunny Redemption Sailing, your bi-weekly-ish voyage for BS3 Gaming News, is not true 70mm because only 41 theaters can display that. However, the sound is far better in IMAX. Crashing waves, clashing shields, and cracking lightning vibrated the floor. Nolan is still an elitist about audio though, so dialogue was still often drowned out. I don't make that mythological metaphor regarding the movie lightly either. Christopher Nolan has an Olympus-level vision in all of his movies, and that's always been to ground the story as much as possible with tinges of the fantastical, as if to say reality can still be weird and interesting. For instance, real people going into a dream world with understandable logic in Inception, flipping semi-trucks to sell a man in a batsuit fighting a guy with clown makeup in The Dark Knight, and sending a farmer across space and time because love is the 5th dimension. Yeah, I think Interstellar is where his usual auteur shtick broke, and is heavily overrated. Fight me in the comments, or like and subscribe if you enjoy that take. Of course, real when it comes to the Trojan War is very much in the eye of the beholder, and we'll get to that. But even when I criticized many of Nolan's choices, I always understood why he did that from an artistic standpoint. When people talk about media literacy, this is part of what I believe they mean. I.e., the ability for someone to put aside one's like or dislike of something and try to understand authorial intent even if they disagree with its ultimate result. Though I understand some of his points, such as the Viking-like ships, though it was understandable, I think, to have seaworthy ships quickly, History Buff's video nitpicking the Odyssey bothers me when it criticizes the Trojan horse not having wheels. Like, who cares? I liked the version that was constructed more of planks in 2004's Troy, but that's also a deviation and was not criticized. So I don't understand what these kinds of tiny things are about. What's more dangerous, though, is his lazy criticizing of defenses of the casting as people saying it's just a myth. To delve further into what I mean by nitpicking, you can be annoyed by the infamous Batman armor for Agamemnon, but you could also say that about any armor in Troy, or Jason and the Argonauts from 1963, etc. Even the Greeks who depicted the 2.5 episodes we have of the 8-episode epic cycle on pottery didn't get the armor design right. So what's important is not the design, but what is said by it. Even as you don't like it, I hope you recognize it's meant to set King Agamemnon's evil apart Darth Vader-like, with the spine of his daughter as part of his helmet to symbolize the power of sacrifice and how war takes the innocent so easily. If you can overlook these tiny things, or even big things like how they changed the concept of Xenia into a more golden rule like fictional Zeus's law, thematic verisimilitude, meaning internal consistency to the driving theme of the Odyssey of hospitality, is also still very much there, as I'll discuss. I highly recommend this video by Pentex Productions if you want to deep dive on the concept of verisimilitude. In any event, though, you should mainly wonder why the white casting choices didn't get criticized by history buffs and others as historically inaccurate, and there weren't loud calls for only Greeks to be cast since it is their mythology and we're being historically accurate, right? Like, I get it if you're not personally attracted to Lupita Nyong'o, But Helen's mom was originally impregnated by Zeus in the form of a swan, and then she hatched from an egg. so historical accuracy goes out the window when it has anything to do with her. Besides, Lupita absolutely would launch 1,000 ships. This is proven by the very first page of the open source translation of the Odyssey I read for this video by Samuel Butler from 1900. And I'm still reading because this poem is dense with meaning, symbolism, history, and substories, and I can't imagine how long it would take to be sung in original Greek, though I'm sure it sounds beautiful this way. I quote, "Poseidon has now departed to the distant Ethiopians, the Ethiopians that are sundered in twain, the uttermost of men, abiding some where Hyperion sinks and some where he rises." With that opening quote about Poseidon visiting Ethiopia, Butler is likely referring to Ethiopia, which Herodotus described in portions of books 2, 3, 4, 7, and 9 of his histories or inquiries. To quote, "The land south of Elephantine, i.e. an island in the southern Nile River now opposite Aswan, Egypt, now begins to be inhabited by Ethiopians. Half the population of the island are Ethiopians and half Egyptians. These Ethiopians, to whom Cambyses sent the fish-eaters, are said to be the tallest and most beautiful of all men." Unfortunately for Herodotus, he is completely wrong by a distance of several hundred miles to the west, because the actual land of Ethiopia is rumored to be the location of the wealthy kingdom of Punt, which has been lost to time other than Egyptian records, and eventually became the mighty kingdom of Aksum that ruled Yemen for a time. The geographic inaccuracy of the literal first classical Greek historian was likely mediated through Greek trade contacts with Egyptians, who would have called the area of Sudan Nubia. I'm digressing a bit, though let me know if you'd like me to tackle Bronze Age Egypt at some point by commenting about it. But I love this period of history, so ancient that even ancient Greeks thought it was ancient, as well as the myriad complexities of Bronze Age civilization that people have dismissed too often as unsophisticated, such as when describing Judaism and Christianity as a Bronze Age myth. Which, believe me, I'll be deconstructing religious myths plenty later in the video, but just calling it Bronze Age is lazy. Suffice it to say, though, that Greeks of the time, while culturally ill-informed and a bit exoticizing of Ethiopians, did admire the physical appearance of Africans south of Egypt. Which means the online incels can sit down once and for all. QE freaking D. Yet, the debate over historical accuracy is endlessly fascinating to me because we can accurately trace the way people see themselves and others while being technically inaccurate. Also, on page 43 of the Butler translation, Menelaus is also mentioned as taking a wrong turn to Africa, so Greeks were not averse to including Africa in stories. Apparently in Crete, most of, quote, the fleet was driven onto the rocks and wrecked, but the crews just managed to save themselves. As for the 5 other ships, they were taken by winds and seas to Egypt, where Menelaus gathered much gold and substance among people of an alien speech. Per page 52, this is the reason why he was unable to help while Agamemnon was murdered. Since we're talking about geography, it's also important to mention that Sparta is not actually accessible by sea as it was for Telemachus' ships in the movie, but is several hundred miles inland. It's also what would have then been the capital of the state of Mycenae at that time as opposed to Laconica, the popularized Spartan state that was founded after the Dorians invaded during the Bronze Age collapse. It does make sense from a pacing and cinematic language standpoint why they relocated it, though. Once Sparta has been sufficiently moved to smooth Telemachus' arrival, a little bit too much in my opinion, on page 53 of the screenplay, in the scene where Telemachus meets Menelaus and Helen, her reveal is more starkly written than I expected. Yet I'm not surprised the movie is frank about how abusive Menelaus is, considering the way his bro Agamemnon was dealt with by Clytemnestra. Both Helen and Clytemnestra are played brilliantly by Lupita Nyong'o, in what I believe after my second viewing is an attempt to realistically portray an impossible box where women are punished by society whether they fight their abusers or choose to remain stoic. Therefore, though I'm still not the biggest fan of the way the movie handled her characterization, as I'll get to, I somewhat retract my statement from the initial impressions video that Helen was just a pure victim, because I also saw more of Lupita's quiet strength in my second viewing and with the aid of being closer to a taller screen. This is why, though I'll always respect people only seeing something once and just not personally liking it because taste is subjective, media literacy, digestion, and possibly multiple viewings or readings of a work are needed to avoid Emily Wilson-style hot takes that miss details like this, that Christopher Nolan trusts the audience to find in the frame in a way modern directors often don't, though I do think key details were not explained well. She knows her stuff, but I'm glad I didn't buy her translation or get baited by her negging of the movie as cynical and condescending marketing for her new translation. Anyway, I'll read from the relevant part of Nolan's screenplay now. Menelaus. I'm Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, husband of Helen. Perhaps you've heard of Helen? Menelaus turns to the profile of the beautiful woman, 40s, sitting next to him. He lifts his hand to her chin. Menelaus, the face that launched 1,000 ships. He gently pulls her face around towards Telemachus. Menelaus, now maybe just 500. I understand its inclusion, but I hate this joke. Brief sidebar. The other side of her face is viciously scarred. So is her right arm, which I only noticed upon my second viewing in IMAX. Menelaus, a lot of good men left on the battlefields of Troy for this face. Helen, and your brother's ambition. She takes in Telemachus with cool eyes, perhaps recognition. Compared to page 54 through 57 of the Butler translation, where the text explains that Helen has been given divine drugs to numb the pain, which could have been shown at the table while Menelaus is talking about Egypt if Nolan wanted to adapt that scene. She also describes how Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, quote, entered the city of Troy, and no one said anything to him. I alone recognized him and began to question him, but he was too cunning for me. When, however, I had washed and anointed him and had given him clothes, and after I had sworn a solemn oath not to betray him to the Trojans until he had got safely back to his own camp and to the ships, he told me all that the Achaeans meant to do. Helen continues, he killed many Trojans and got much information before he reached the Argive camp. For all which things the Trojan women made lamentation. But for my own part I was glad, for my heart was beginning to yearn after my home, and I was unhappy about the wrong that Venus had done me in taking me over there, away from my country, my girl, and my lawful wedded husband, who is indeed by no means deficient either in person or understanding. A lot of the reason why it's taking me so long to read the poem is because it's filled with so many amazing little moments like this, that eventually any adaptation attempting to comprehensively tell it is going to need to trim a lot. Which is also part of why I like the movie The Return with Ralph Fiennes better, because it's just adapting Odysseus's return to Ithaca and focusing on that. Still, I could just imagine that being said with a little bit of snark by Helen under her breath to reinforce the themes of this movie. Also, later bawdy declarations by Menelaus to tell more tall tales about Odysseus being rich or poor or whatever were kind of repetitive, and could have been trimmed to allow Helen to have a more active role in informing Telemachus about his father's honor. For telling her the entire plan while trusting she wouldn't blab is quite honorable, no? It would also have made the still abusive relationship between Helen and Menelaus a smidge more nuanced, and be excellent foreshadowing for Odysseus' eventual beggar disguise, perhaps with a haughty dismissal of him by Helen at first to parallel Antinous' own actions later in the movie. Though again, the active role of a goddess muddles the question of agency. Troy, a Total War saga, deals with this ambiguity in its opening cutscene by wondering if people just blame all their impulsive decisions on the gods.
To get the bit about gods, you need to pick Agamemnon.
Are we mere playthings of the gods? Or do we plead divine influence to justify our foolish choices?
He's taken her! He's taken my wife! You've risked the safety of Troy.
Troy is my home now.
You have my oath, brother. She will be returned to you.
Brother, I can fight! Go. Seek shelter. There'll be plenty of fighting ahead.
Helen's flight was a grave wound to Achaean pride. King Menelaus will have his revenge. And his brother will have his war with Troy. Just as the gods in...
Before I go back to the video, I can't not include this awesome opening cutscene and how even it gets the armor wrong, with no one complaining. As far as I'm aware,
so it has come to this. Good men, torn from their kin, to rage and spill the blood of other men's foes. But we will not be forgotten. Our deeds shall be known, even when our bones are dust scattered on the wind. And our names will inspire the mighty to rise.
Similarly to how Odysseus criticizes gods for not speaking in a way humans would recognize, and Athena responds with an argument from necessity regarding who moves the wind and waves, a topic to also deconstruct later. Counterpoint to all that, though. Lupita, as a talented and respected actress, also likely had a great deal of input on the development of this scene, and I haven't heard of any workplace complaints from the set. As a result, unless she makes any statements otherwise, it's reasonable to assume that she agreed with the direction of the scene. I also believe Nolan was so clipped in order to make a focused point about the imperial coveting of exoticized bodies, of Menelaus treating a human being as a prize to be won, just like the trade routes of the Dardanelles Strait that Agamemnon coveted. The latter, of course, explained in a very clunky way by Odysseus in the flashback with Penelope, where Matt Damon and Anne Hathaway thankfully showed great, if a bit strained due to Nolan's clipped writing style when it comes to dialogue and character direction, chemistry that carried an otherwise awkward scene. I can also see the movie's treatment of both Helen and Clytemnestra, two of the only significant black characters in the entire film, other than Zendaya's Athena. Sorry, Travis Scott, you really should have gotten to sing, making some Black American and African audience members uncomfortable. This is likely because it's a reality that many women of color deal with every day and don't have to be taught to them by the movies the way white audiences often are. I wonder how my African fiancée from Eswatini will react to seeing this when she's finally in the United States to make both of our birthdays memorable in April 2027, or more likely with all the visa shenanigans, I instead see her and her, at that point, 11-year-old son in Eswatini. That date is unfortunate since we originally planned on October 2026, which logistical difficulties made necessary to delay. However, it still doesn't hurt any less to be yearning for a home that's so far away, and so the movie resonated more for me personally because of that. Because I relate to being adrift and alone for the better part of our nearly 2-year relationship as of September 13th. Though that is completely outside of our control and not anyone's fault, as communication across cultures and distance is difficult for anyone. In better news, my baby bird is super excited to see Zendaya's performance and told me that she feels Zendaya is a presence you just absorb. And also gave me permission to paraphrase that. For the little screen time that she gets, I completely agree with that assessment, though I think her costuming is kind of lazy as it looks like she just walked off the set of Dune Part 3 for 5 minutes at a time. Looking forward to finally reading that sandworm-sized novel and rewatching both the movies on 4K Blu-ray. Though, I probably will not do so for a review, apart from the off-the-cuff discussions I will likely have with Kevin on Sunny Redemption Sailing, because I have a lot of different ideas for History Flights already, and reviewing all that on top of it would be so enormous my head would explode. You might want to prepare for your head to explode too. One of the reasons I chose Butler's translation, other than that it was 99 cents on Kindle, is that in 1922, Samuel Butler made the surprising, for the time, but highly logically supported claim that Homer may have been a woman. Someone arguing that now would make a bunch of online incels' heads explode for sure, but Homer is likely not a single person to begin with, as the epic cycle was being told and retold in plays such as Euripides' The Trojan Women for centuries, and as with any oral tradition such as this or the Bible, many things, including the identity of the author, are lost and can only be guessed at by scholars. Plus, as discussed by moments like this clip from Pompeii Out of Time with Tom Hiddleston, historians can often assume that certain historical figures are male just because they're in a role that is assumed to be for women. So Butler's evidence for this in the essay, The Authoress of the Odyssey, is a fascinating case of the evolving study of history.
Hold on, Tom.
Wait, what?
Well, this place wasn't owned by a businessman. She was a businesswoman, not Julius Felix, but Julia.
Ah. This is helpful and embarrassingly accurate archaeologist and professor of classics, Katie Barrett. Fresh from her own excavation, right here in Pompeii. So, Katie, look, here's the thing. When I was at university, I was taught that Rome was a patriarchy, and that women, by and large, couldn't own property, certainly not run a business this size.
And that's part of why Pompeii is such a crucial site, because it lets us see what Roman life was actually like, and not just what wealthy and usually male authors wanted to represent it.
When I came to the Fashion episode, I felt sure that here, at any rate, the writer was drawing from life, Butler says, and that Nausicaa, Queen Arete, and Alcinous were real people more or less travestied. And on turning to Colonel Muir's work, Language and Literature of Ancient Greece, from 1850, as explained in a footnote by Project Gutenberg, I saw that he was of the same opinion. Nevertheless, I found myself continually aghast at the manner in which men were made to speak and act, especially, for example, during the games in honor of Ulysses described in Book 8. Colonel Muir says that the women engross the chief part of the small stock of common sense allotted to the community. So they do, but it never occurred to me to ask myself whether men commonly write brilliant books in which the women are made more sensible than the men. I can definitely see his point regarding the ghastliness of our hero's actions, as the violence Odysseus does throughout the story, such as executing all the handmaids, after all of the suitors, would not have raised any eyebrows in classical Greece, where violence was just a fact of life and excelling in it was honored with games. It did also bother me that half the suitors surrendered, as it inflates Odysseus' honor compared to the poem. Again, global box office. Butler, for his part, argues that Princess Nausicaa is rendered with far more psychological nuance, autonomy, and warmth than any male character in the poem, so the author could be drawing from her life experience. Butler may be writing facetiously when it comes to that, because Nausicaa is one of the few women Odysseus doesn't try to seduce when they encounter each other on page 84, but she's likely been forgotten because she's basically a quest giver telling Odysseus how to get to the next part of his journey. If there's warmth and nuance there, it doesn't come through very well in his translation when she explains, quote, "I am afraid of the gossip and scandal that may be set on foot against me later on, for the people here are very ill-natured, and some low fellow, if he met us, might say, 'Who is this fine-looking stranger that is going about with Nausicaa? Where did she find him? I suppose she is going to marry him. Perhaps he is a vagabond sailor whom she has taken from some foreign vessel, for we have no neighbors, or some god that has, at last, come down from heaven in answer to her prayers, and she is going to live with him all the rest of her life. It would be a good thing if she could take herself off and find a husband somewhere else, for she will not look at one of the many excellent young Phaeacians who are in love with her.' This is the kind of disparaging remark that would be made about me, and I cannot complain, for I should myself be scandalized at seeing any other girl do the like, and go about with men in spite of everybody. while her father and mother were still alive, and without having been married in the face of all the world. So, autonomy and nuance are very low compared to our modern sensibilities for such things. How serious Butler was about this conclusion is difficult to determine because it may have been an attempt to needle the stuffy scholars of Victorian gentlemen's clubs of the era. In other words, 19th century trolling. However, he also rejects the idea that Odysseus, a name he hopes will one day supplant the Latin Ulysses, something which came true for even the most casual adaptations ranging from Arthur to Wishbone, wandered all over the Mediterranean. To this end, he presents a different map from the traditional one I showed and traced with my flight simulator cursor at the beginning of the video. Instead, Butler localizes the journey more to Sicily and environs because he thinks Homer was Sicilian and living in Trapani around 1000 to 800 BCE. Another reason I think he's serious? Quote, as I have said in my concluding chapter, I do not care whether the Odyssey was written by a man or a woman, nor yet where the poet or poetess lived who wrote it. All I care about is the knowing as much as I can about the poem, and I believe that scholars both in England and on the continent would have helped me to fuller understanding if they had seen their way to doing so. Besides, the logical idea that Homer could be multiple men and women and etc. leaves plenty of room for a transgender retelling of the Odyssey someday. If I'm ever influential enough to do that, I will make it. Nolan got a fantastic performance out of Elliot Page. Perks of working with actors you know. And despite my criticism of the sound mixing, I give him and the IMAX Corporation credit for inventing a noise dampener and a mirror system to allow such an intimate and harrowing accusation by Sinon to be filmed in IMAX at all, and the Field of the Dead. However, Sinon is still ultimately a sacrificial pawn for someone else's arc, rather than having much of his own agency. More on that when I get to the Aeneid. Having an adaptation of the Odyssey, where much of it is narrated by Homer depicted as a cisgender or transgender woman, distinctions which are not meant to divide or offend, but rather classify accurately, as cis comes from the Latin for on this side of, for those who are assigned female at birth and align with that have been culturally considered default for a few centuries, would have ended this in an amazing way, I feel. Especially since the queer website Paxes goes into detail about multiple transgender themes in Greek mythology, and I'll quote specifically regarding hermaphroditus, with all the emphases original unless otherwise noted. Androgynous deities are a feature of many mythologies around the world, it says, and Greek mythology is no exception. Although intersex individuals are not inherently trans unless the individual identifies as such, Hermaphroditus is included here because he wasn't born intersex but was transformed by godly magic. Hermaphroditus was the child of Aphrodite, goddess of love and lesbians, and Hermes, the messenger god. One day he was bathing in a pool when a nymph saw him and fell in love. She prayed to Aphrodite and Hermes that they would be united forever and threw herself at him. When they touched, the gods merged them into one person with breasts and a penis, which is where we get the now outdated term for an intersex person, hermaphrodite. When Hermaphroditus emerged from the pool and saw his new form, he prayed to his parents to bless the pool, so that anyone who bathed there would be similarly transformed, and his wish was granted. The spring eventually became the Salmacis fountain in what is now Turkey, and classical authors recounted how the water made men effeminate if they drank from it. Unfortunately, transitioning these days requires a bit more than a drink. But you can read about what you might need for a great MTF transition here. Great aside by that website. Anyway, back to the quote. Hermaphroditus was unusually beautiful and androgynous and became one of the erotes, a collection of gods associated with love and sex. He was considered the original intersex person, and all others came from him, as well as being the god of effeminacy, androgyny, and marriage. The union of masculine and feminine when Hermaphrodite and the nymph were joined symbolized how men and women were joined by marriage, so he was often worshipped, especially on the 4th day of the month, the luckiest day to have a wedding. This is an amazing resource, with links out to Sappho's poems about Aphrodite, tales of Luciphus of Crete, a trans companion of Artemis, and discussions of how Prometheus was, quote, busy shaping humans out of clay, but before he was done, he got drunk with his buddy Dionysus, god of wine. When he came back to finish the job, he accidentally stuck some of the wrong genitalia on the wrong people. Which is why we have men who like men and women who like women. Okay, that's one explanation. Talking about race and gender as it relates to Nolan's movie begs the question, why are white Western Europeans, as opposed to modern Greeks themselves, the ones getting up in arms about all these casting changes? My hypothesis is that this is because of the literal millennia of cultural appropriation and universalization of Greek culture, starting after the Romans conquered Greece in 146 BCE and destroyed Corinth the same year they did so to Carthage. This was eventually built on, with British people becoming the universal Hollywood actors for Greek mythologies such as Jason and the Argonauts. The Romans, though, were especially inaccurate to the original poem, changing the names of Greek gods to claim them as their own while creating an amazing fanfic of the Odyssey, the Aeneid, as a foundational myth. If you've never read the Aeneid, it's about a Trojan named Aeneas, who has a very similar journey to Odysseus, including encountering an exotic foreign woman, this time in the form of Dido, the semi-mythical founder of Carthage, Rome's greatest foe during the Punic Wars. He later goes on to be the ancestor of Romulus, the, again, semi-mythical founder of Rome, who killed his brother Remus. This established concepts of honor and just violence at the core of Roman culture that shaped the Roman brand of masculinity, Roman law, and Roman civilizing mission, and ended up forming a lot of the foundation for Western Europe as we know it, for better or for worse. Anyway, we all had to translate the Aeneid for Latin class in high school, and for extra credit I made a summary for my entire class that I originally wrote on Google's doomed Wikipedia competitor, Knol. Knol. I will literally subscribe to your channel if you leave a comment below about your favorite article on Knol. Unfortunately, I don't remember whose translation we used and could not move the full text to Google Docs before Knol collapsed, so sadly it's as lost as the other books of the epic cycle. However, the first two books of the Aeneid are most closely related to the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey anyway, and when I say this is one of the greatest works of fan fiction in the ancient world, I am not kidding. Aeneas spends much of the beginning of the story gallivanting in the background of both stories like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet. Or perhaps like Timon and Pumbaa if you've ever seen The Lion King 1.5. Oh man, those were the days, including enjoying the surprisingly fun Choose Your Own Adventure River Adventure game on Disc 2 of the DVD. Before I begin, I'll also briefly note that the Roman name of Ulysses is used for Odysseus, and that my grandfather, who died just a few days ago last year at 98 years old, was very pleased to hear about anything to do with my Latin lessons because he'd taken them too. So this is dedicated to him. Without further ado, first, Virgil sings of the future. In it, Aeneas's great-great-great-grandson in turn fathers Rhea Silvia, who gives birth to Romulus and Remus, who then finally found Rome. Next, the great history of Rome is spelled out, ending with the apotheosis of Julius Caesar. This first part is basically a summary of the book's entire premise in one paragraph. Juno is upset that some Trojans, whom she hates because she lost Paris's judgment, will still survive after the Trojan War. She is even more angered to think that they will one day destroy Carthage, her favorite city. So she gets Aeolus, the Wind King, to unleash the four winds on Aeneas's fleet and block him from getting to Italy, in return for the hand of the nymph, Deiopeia. Several of Aeneas's ships are destroyed before Neptune, angry at Aeolus for infringing on his turf, the sea, shoos the winds away. Aeneas and his surviving men beach on a strange coast. While his crew sets up camp, Aeneas meets a mysterious lady, who is really his mother, Venus, in disguise. Venus proceeds to tell him that they are in Libya, and that on the next right is Carthage, to be destroyed in the future by Aeneas's descendants. As Cato the Elder put it, Carthago delenda est, or Carthage must be destroyed. Fortunately for him, Carthage just got founded by Queen Dido, who was kicked out of Tyre by her brother, evil Pygmalion, not Pygmalion the statue guy, after the latter killed Dido's husband. Afterwards, Venus goes to Jove and asks him if he gave up on the Trojans, whom she loves because she won Paris's judgment. Jove proceeds to more or less repeat to Venus what Virgil just said about the history of Rome. Meanwhile, Aeneas and co. arrive in the streets of Carthage as they marvel at the structures that are just being built. What a waste. They wind up in a temple where Aeneas sees statues detailing the Trojan War and meets Dido. Since they are famous in Carthage, Dido invites them to a banquet and asks Aeneas to relate their story so far. Then in Book 2, or A Funny Thing Happened in the Trojan War, Aeneas recounts how the Trojan War ended, starting with the construction of the Trojan horse, which is step 1 of the Greeks' surprise attack. As step 2, the Greeks sneak a battalion inside the horse, abandon their camp, move the invasion fleet to the island of Tenedos, a real island off the coast of Asia Minor, to wait for the finale, and leave the horse outside the city. While viewing this strange, hill-sized object, the Trojans debate what to do with it. A high priest named Laocoon is foremost among the group that wants to destroy the horse, and he throws a spear at its belly to try to prove his point, but to no avail. Then the Trojans capture a Greek named Sinon, who Virgil reveals volunteered to be captured so he could help the Greeks enter the city. Brief aside, including this by letting Sinon volunteer for the war and horse duty rather than being tricked into it by both of them would undermine both Antinous and Odysseus's arcs while raising Sinon's agency. However, even though Elliot Page is written as a straight-up male, his queerness is not invisible, so it's, well, interesting that, again, the only queer person in the movie dies as a prop for a straight man's character arc. Not quite bury your gaze, but close. Back to my high school summary of the Aeneid. When questioned, Sinon makes up a sob story about how a man named Palamedes was put to death on trumped-up charges by Ulysses' doing. Sinon, being a friend of Palamedes, was harassed by Ulysses. Then, just as the Greeks were about to leave, violent storms kept them from embarking. To remedy this, they, conveniently enough, had to sacrifice Sinon to ensure the success of their trip. But Sinon escaped. Meanwhile, the Greeks plundered a temple to Minerva and had to construct the horse to get home safely. The Trojans apparently forget the saying, "Beware Greeks bearing gifts," and bring the Trojan horse into the city. The next day, Laocoon and his 2 sons are crushed by 2 vicious sea snakes, who then hide under the temple of Minerva. This event sets the Trojans against destroying the horse because they believe that Laocoon had damaged a divine gift and was killed for his impiety. That night, as the Trojans are sleeping, the Greek fleet returns, and the commandos inside the Trojan horse exited and opened the gates to the invading army. At the same time, Hector appears to Aeneas in a dream and warns him to leave the city so that he can have great-great-great-grandchildren to found Rome. Aeneas' first response, however, is to take up arms, even though he doesn't stand a chance, and gather a few buddies by the names of Ripheus, Epitus, Hypanis, Dymas, and Coroebus to join him. I apologize if any of the pronunciations I have made or will make in this essay are being butchered. Aeneas bumps into a Greek captain named Androgeos, who mistakes the Trojans for friends, until they perform the classic kill the guards and take their armor trick on him. Soon they encounter Cassandra, who is being captured. When they attempt to rescue her, Aeneas' men are attacked by their own side. The Greeks give chase once Aeneas frees Cassandra, and they manage to kill Coroebus, followed by Ripheus. Hypanis, Epitus, and Dymas fall to friendly fire, leaving only Aeneas, of course. Meanwhile, the gate to the royal palace is besieged by the Greeks, led by Pyrrhus. Obviously, Aeneas joins in the defense. Somehow he gets all the front row seats. Soon enough, the attackers chop through the door, kill the guards, and attack the royal family. King Priam arms himself, even though he's really old, and arrives just in time to see Pyrrhus brutally slaughter one of his sons, named Polytes. Priam angrily throws a spear at Pyrrhus, but it is blocked by Pyrrhus' armor, and then Pyrrhus finally kills Priam. Aeneas, luckily for us, witnesses all this, and then narrowly escapes the palace chaos. On the way, he spots Helen and decides to kill her for causing all of this. Unfortunately, it wouldn't help much anyway. But he is thwarted by Venus, who persuades him instead to help his family. Aeneas arrives at his house and tries to persuade his father, Anchises, to leave, but Anchises does not budge. Suddenly, Ascanius' head miraculously bursts into flames. After this, Anchises prays for another sign to show that the gods are looking down upon them. In response, the gods send an asteroid crashing into Mount Ida. This causes Anchises to change his mind and leave with Aeneas and the rest of his family. Aeneas carries Anchises and the Trojan gods, with Ascanius at his side and Creusa, his wife, at a good pace behind, intending to head for an old shrine to Ceres the bereft. However, Creusa gets lost and dies. Aeneas commands his servants to hide his family in the shrine and tries to go back into Troy to find Creusa, but he is prevented from doing so by the ghost of Creusa, who again tells him to focus on his mission. And besides, this apparition says, "You'll be married to an Italian girl soon anyway, so no harm done." Aeneas tries to hug the ghost 3 times, and he fails to do so 3 times. Finally, Aeneas and his family head for Mount Ida with a group of refugees. People who are exiled from any community, whether Ithaca or Troy, or a political or religious community, hence the stubborn clinging by MAGA morons to their cult to avoid the social costs of ostracism. Are rarely met with honest engagement by people who either initiated or supported their ostracization in the first place, and this reigns true across the Aeneid and the Odyssey. Rather than addressing the specific, grounded reasons for a person's departure, those who remain behind frequently construct grand, comforting myths to explain the exile away and complete the wholesale alienation. We see this when decentralized groups of former members of the Baha'i faith are flattened into monolithic caricatures labeled as subversive agents or passive foot soldiers of vast geopolitical projects like Western neoliberalism, a term wielded as a boogeyman. It is an ancient reflex, when faced with uncomfortable truth, reduce human dissent to institutional treason. Nolan's cinematic rendering underscores that Odysseus' true tragedy is not merely physical distance, but the psychological horror of a survivor of war, stripped of his voice and home while a sweeping narrative takes shape without him and as his mind is numbed by lotus flowers. So say a lot of us 6 years post-pandemic. In Nolan's framing, where the journey carries the weight of alienation and psychological displacement, the islands Odysseus encounters are spaces of total narrative containment that you, quote, can only reach by sea, according to Circe in page 76 of the screenplay. Whether trapped under Calypso's gilded isolation or caught in the illusions of Circe, the danger is identical. The exile is held in a place where their history is rewritten, their true motivations are denied, and their past is erased by those who insist they know best. While Odysseus was marooned from Ithaca, the suitors didn't just consume Odysseus' food. As we see with MAGA and Doge animals looting the treasury for money for the past year and a half, which will likely continue to occur the next 2 and change until a democratic Odysseus comes to kick their asses once and for all. I wish they'd gone into more detail on that, and the reasons for this will become clear when I elaborate on the Bronze Age collapse. They also declared Odysseus' journey meaningless, rewrote his character, and assumed control of the home he built. This is precisely the dynamic at play when critics such as Wahid Azal, in a bizarre turn, for he is also an ex-Baha'i, so one cannot conclude anything but that he is highly motivated to aggrandize his own ego in his ostracism of others as not real ex-Baha'is compared to him, so he never has to share victimhood with anyone else. Reduce ex-members or dissenters to mere tokens of external ideological corruption. It is a form of rhetorical marooning. When the wanderer is marooned, commentators like Azal construct their own self-serving reality from the comfortable mainland of their laptops. By slapping macro-level political labels onto complex human experiences, Azal builds a digital Ogygia around dissenters to strand them on an electronic island where their actual words, documentation, and personal integrity do not need to be addressed, because he has already declared them ideological enemies from afar. That's the name of the island that's the home of Calypso, where Odysseus was imprisoned for 7 years. Whether Calypso is actually a goddess, or just a gal who found memory-fogging lotuses that I think a lot of people might love to take to forget the last 10 years of American politics, I really did not like that Odysseus was a completely unwilling participant in his 7-year captivity, because it takes away from his reputation as a charmer. However, as I mentioned in my first impressions video, I understand why his unfaithfulness was cut to avoid muddling modern audiences' ability to root for him, especially in culturally conservative regions of the world, such as China and the Middle East, that contributed greatly to the worldwide box office totals. It's frustrating that such places hold mainstream films hostage these days, especially on LGBTQ issues. That's reality for global blockbusters, though, and blocks this movie busted, grossing $931 million as of August 5th, 2026. Anyway, it is easy to paint an exile as a geopolitical phantom when you refuse to engage with their specific grievances. It is far harder to acknowledge that their departure might stem from authentic disillusionment, historical truth-seeking, or the institutional failure of religion to provide a coherent organizing principle of society without oppressing people. Whether in the Hindu caste system, despite that faith's surprising tolerance, Buddhist violence despite its exhortations of peace, Sharia law's trampling of minority rights, or the Baha'i administrative order's propaganda compared to secular democratic constitutional law. I don't believe, as substantial key 7910 does, that a new world order can or should do away with religion, but I do think that the key to religious peace is to disorganize it, by decoupling religion from any sense of temporal power, and let everyone be their own rabbis, their own imams, their own popes. In other words, this person has a reason to be disillusioned by religion that I can understand, and dismissing independent voices as mere Western puppets says far less about the exiles than it does about the anxieties and intellectual shortcuts of anti-intellectual and perpetually navel-gazing post-colonial critics like Azal that miss the point. This is similar to how the scene with the dead rising to drink blood sacrifice is more about the living needing to properly honor those who have been lost. Odysseus not realizing that this could heal his trauma and guilt is why he took so long to get home. Regardless, that failure to observe proper procedure is on him and Azal, not on the dead or the exiles. In ancient times, the latter was not a mere political abstraction, but a profound destruction of social bonds with wide-ranging consequences. Hence why in Athens it was believed that people should only be exiled for 10 years by democratic vote of the Athenian Assembly, or Ecclesia, which in fact only constituted 6,000 people chosen from among 30,000 citizens, which were a small fraction of the population, with of course a huge underclass of women, slaves, and foreigners. Still, whether navigating Homer's mythic seas or the psychological isolation central to Nolan's vision, those who walk away are seeking something fundamental, a return to their own agency and truth. Dismissing their journey as the work of external subversion says far less about the exiles than it does about the anxieties of those remaining on the shore. Predictably, a day after I wrote the preceding portion of the script, titled The Ogygia of Anti-Intellectual Exile, because Wahid Azal has absolutely no life and has made me his mission, he manufactured a nearly 1,000-word pseudo-intellectual dismissal of me in the joke of an essay called Militant Secular Atheists Are Not Intellectuals in a single day, not realizing that he is a Charybdis of failure, a big sucking hole that's dangerous if approached too close, but is ultimately easily avoidable, his roaring only adding to the themes of my videos. Sure, I'm currently going through a scylla with him where he has harassed me and doxed my name, face, and address, as well as dragged me into frivolous litigation at the Copyright Claims Board over what is so obviously fair use when using a photograph of his face in a parodic thumbnail in a pathetic attempt to intimidate my journalism of him. I go over that more in History Flights number 10, Sunny Redemption Sailing number 57, and The Hidden Faith episode 7, my 250th video. What he doesn't realize, though, is that the angrier and more desperately aggressive he gets while hiding behind one-sided and unfair defamation forms to block my videos in Australia, the less incentive I have to negotiate on anything. Which he tried to do by impertinently demanding I delete my, quote, BS posts about him and saying he would do the same in return without anything to indicate that I should trust him, after 7 months of harassment. It keeps me motivated to educate the rest of the world on everything wrong with him. For instance, by drawing attention into his early life as a rentier capitalist enforcer for mommy and daddy landlords, or his messaging of an anonymous source when that person was 12, who is currently on a vacation and will be back to help me keep exposing his demented ass on August 11th. Like Scylla, he's only doing minor damage compared to the $2,500 I'm likely to get when I counterclaim for 18 U.S.C. Section 512F misrepresentation for his repeated false DMCA claims against my videos and the Copyright Claims Board case. He exposes his case as motivated by malicious intent, with wishes such as, quote, and on that note, just as he is not a journalist, a lie, nor runs a legitimate production company, also a lie, based on his false attempts to report me to the IRS for trying to teach children how to make videos. I don't understand this man. Real name illegally doxed is not an intellectual either. He, Sikh, because he is a terrible grammarian, no more and no less than just another arrogant white man sputtering nonsense during the death throes of his toxic civilization. May he croak soon and allow this world to be liberated from his oxygen-thieving pestilence of white male imperial faggotry. This spiteful, racist, and homophobic conclusion gives away the game of the whole essay, which is to pretend to be scholarly while lumping me in with other militant atheists and dismiss us all as a class, just because I stuck up for an ex-Baha'i he was bullying, despite his whataboutism deflections about me being reductionist and strawmanning. This is his only argument ever. I am rubber, you are glue. He says that I collapsed thousands of years of rich, nuanced theological, mystical, and philosophical traditions into simplistic fundamentalist literalism, and that by treating all religion through the lens of extreme literalism, I critique a caricature rather than engaging with sophisticated theology or metaphysics. Yet he completely mischaracterizes my position on religion. Look, people are going to find metaphorical and selective ways to interpret their sacred texts. I've never criticized my Christian fiancée for the ways beliefs of her denomination, Zion Christian Church, differ from the Roman Catholicism I grew up with because that's very personal. The community there is very focused on reconciling African spiritual practices with Christianity as well, in ways some in South Africa called cult-like in the past, but I think are very admirable. Meanwhile, she respects my disbelief, and I find Protestant literalism and Catholic insistence on papal infallibility silly. If all Christians were like the love of my life, I'd probably still be a Christian. However, the utility of religion as a series of organized institutions with gatekeeping theologists is in how said institutions act upon the world. Vocal secularists like me often focus on literalist and fundamentalist interpretations because those are the exact forms of religion that wield political power, influence public policy, suppress human rights, and dismantle scientific education in a way that could soon lead to the Bronze Age style collapse that Wahid gloats about. Engaging abstract metaphysical models, while an interesting philosophical thought exercise, such as the time that my secular humanist group respectfully debated a contingent of Jesuit friars when I was at American University, 16 years ago, what the heck, does little to address real-world harm. He also asserts that militant secularism rests on scientism, the ideological assumption that empirical science is the sole arbiter of truth, meaning, and morality. According to this view, secularists substitute scientific orthodoxy for religious dogma, while claiming objective neutrality. The problem with that argument is that just because a traditional way of looking at the world has been supreme in the past, and modern forms of doing so emerge from it over time, doesn't mean traditional religious beliefs should guide our political decisions now. For instance, Western civilization, like most others, was founded on slavery, but ended up, not entirely out of altruism, including as a wedge to establish colonialism, actively campaigning to abolish it. And abolition arose through questioning biblical assumptions about slavery, including blatantly ignoring the Bible's few rules on fair treatment of said slaves, through public discourse. I highly recommend the linked AMA by Hubert Burnett. One key piece of information he pointed out is that, quote, when it was rhetorically useful, slavery apologists treated all slavery as identical, not admitting that U.S. chattel slavery was very unusual. The Helots were the only identifiable precedent. This argumentative move still happens among defenders of slavery. To compare American slaves to the Helots that made up the permanent underclass of Sparta is an amazing historical rhyme that goes so hard. Anyway, questioning religious assumptions through science and logic is fundamentally different from religious dogmatism because the scientific method, and in turn rational policymaking, engages in questioning, peer review, and falsifiability, whereas religious dogma, as with fascism from Mussolini to MAGA, relies on divine authority and unquestionable pat assertions. Demanding empirical evidence for positive claims about the supernatural is not a lack of intellectualism either. And his demand for formal training in Hermeticism, other esoteric traditions, and theology to critique his internally contradictory and constantly changing mess of a Sufi order is the courtier's reply fallacy. This is because one does not need to master the internal lore of, say, astrology to point out that planetary positions do not dictate human destiny, or of geocentrism to point out that it does not account correctly for Mercury's erratic orbit, but the centrality of the sun does. To quote from the anonymous source he messaged as a minor, no matter what lies Nima says publicly to conceal what he really believes, this is Nima Hizini, the name he went by before he changed it to Wahid Azal in 2004, that I and my source still sometimes use to poke fun at him because, well, he gets to disrespect my real name, apparently, so why should I respect his, except in a court of law? He is deceiving gullible Muslims, Christians, Jews, leftists, and other people he seduces into his circle. He literally believes he is the Messiah, the new prophet, the new savior, and there is no shortage of fantastical, self-appointed titles he has given himself. He has rebranded his new religion multiple times, originally calling it simply Nur, or light, and now changing it to the Bayan. Here are literally his own new list of commandments for his new religion, a messianic cult. These commandments reveal all the superficial entrapment, horrendous egoic self-worship, and do not disclose anything more profound than an MPD, narcissistic personality disorder, which definitely fits him, convincing himself of how wonderful he is. Religions are about internal and external transformation, the opposite of this type of NPD religiosity which litters this material. Actual mystics, whether Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and others, have real discernment between this level of insane self-worship and genuine spirituality. It is the difference between what Eastern Christianity calls prelest, spiritual delusion rooted in self-worship, a deadly trap that can ensnare any mystic. Ayahuasca became a gateway for that internal darkness made manifest, which Wahid used in his religious ceremonies multiple times, and it probably fried his brain because he didn't use it correctly, as guided by a South American mystic or shaman. Back to my source's quote. Everyone who meets this guy is deceived when he holds this back and pretends to be a regular netizen, because Nima is fully aware of the utter heresy he is preaching, which would scandalize any serious Christian, Muslim, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Kabbalist, you name it. Any of the traditions he draws from are clearly against creating new religions. The reason initiation matters is because it maintains consistency and prevents contradiction or alteration of the original substrate. This is how we distinguish fraudulent imitations from authentic, beautiful spirituality. Can Nima come forward and reveal a single public interaction on display where he has actively preached these new commandments for his new religion? Of course not. It is heresy for every tradition, including thelema, that he uses to construct his new syncretic chimera. Science discovers new things, even changes entirely with new evidence rather than having a dogma as opposed to pure consensus, though of course not always perfectly, and then religion adapts with post hoc rationalization, not the other way around. Wahid also argues solely for theology that presumes monotheism. We'd have very different theology with a polytheist group of gods like the ancient Greeks, if they were still around today, but they're gone, and so conveniently are their gods. I am an evidentialist regarding all historical, political, and logical claims, including unprovable ones such as myths, because reason is consistent. This is a rigorous philosophical position with a deep historical tradition running from Epicurus to Hume and Russell to The Dragon in My Garage by Carl Sagan. The entire thrust of my channel is that any time a group of people is organized around an infallible leader, whether political, religious, or economic in the case of video game publishers, political outcomes depend on the benevolence of the autocrat. Once that breaks, war and other policy is determined on a single person or clergy's whim, amid invisible signs from a conveniently absentee and mute god. Examples include Agamemnon chasing after his brother's wife as an excuse to chase economic power, the Arabs waging a holy war of brutal conquest against Eastern Rome, Byzantium, and Persia, which I'll talk about in a future episode of my other video series about medieval Rome, the Empire of Many Lives. Check out my linked prologue. The Crusaders liberating Jerusalem on behalf of the Byzantines at the expense of thousands of Jews and Muslims. Wahhabist fundamentalists declaring all Americans were the great Satan and deciding my cousin, her unborn child, and 3,000 other people had to die on 9/11 when I was 9 fucking years old. George W. Bush feeling guided by God to liberate Iraq to similar results. Hamas literally having in its constitution the extinction of Israel as jihad. Netanyahu's similarly authoritarian ginning up of threats to genocide Palestinians. And finally, Trump invoking a clash of civilizations rhetoric against Iran, as Wahidazal often does against the West. I criticize both actions as I consider them equally morally repugnant. Criticize democracy or curse Greeks for inventing it if you're Zeus. Again, haven't seen him try to smite anyone lately. Religions gained their cachet from social utility to converts, not proof. But democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others tried. The First Amendment prohibiting Congress from making laws respecting an establishment of religion enabled Jews and Muslims to feel safe here because George Washington wrote to a synagogue personally in 1790 that the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Democracy also enabled Wahid the Hypocrite's family to flee from Iran to Australia from the facially constitutional theocracy of Iran in 1979. It also, unlike countries with Sharia law, protected Wahidazal's right to spout off his bizarre claims to be the next manifestation of God in the first place, after his break with the Baha'i faith in 1996 when I was 4, without being executed as kafir. Not to mention he is using it as a shield for his relentless sexual and personal harassment against me with a literal fucking fatwa, Salman Rushdie style, and calls for my death. It similarly allowed him to get an education across the United States and Australia without fear of persecution. To use that education to constantly threaten people and try to intimidate them into thinking he's the supreme authority on everything he talks about, while dismissing entire nations as irredeemably evil, is irony of the highest order, and is why sneering and historically illiterate wannabe gods like him must be defeated by reasoned debate such as this and the careful, meticulous preservation of evidence. I have not only done so, but provided 75 plus pages of exhibits to a DC Superior Court judge to conclusively persuade him that my videos were journalistic in nature. This is bound to grow as I can easily provide to the CCB multiple hundreds of pages to quash his vexatious legal campaign against me once and for all. I speak out behind the mask of DC Shepard against tyranny wherever it rises and from whomever tries to impose it, whether old deranged presidents or false sheikhs, because my grandparents, parents, sister, and so many amazing people it would take too long to include them all, and I myself worked hard to fill my life with education, all the while balancing my strength with disability and getting past passive ideation after mononucleosis in college, while dealing with mockery while sick by a past professor, past contentious divorce, and embracing an odyssey of love I never imagined I could ever have with my fiancé and son, who are safer in Africa than the United States of America, which is infuriating to me. I hate that hatred is so rampant and that the climate is becoming extremely dangerous for everyone wherever they live, threatening a new Bronze Age collapse. Yet I don't think this is inevitable as what he cheers on, because again, he got his education here and is pulling up the ladder on everybody else. A new administration and a new, younger Congress can energize good policy to get us into a war footing on climate change and spur innovative new technologies that meet the demand for cleaning up the climate, which is really the only way forward in the fight against mass extinction that I would rather be talking about and working towards solutions for as part of a rational United States government. I think thanks to not only my formal political science degree, but my continued research into history and surrounding context for popular fiction, I have definitively proven that, when so motivated by a Zeus-like instinct for divine wrath, well, he is not really the serious intellectual he claims because he misunderstands scientific and logical rebuttals of religion alike. Not to mention his attempts to personally impugn my character, especially when making public statements before entering a copyright claims board hearing, are likely to backfire. Speaking of misunderstandings, the adaptation change that bothered me the most personally was the gutting of the entire encounter with Polyphemus. Having Polyphemus say no one is attacking because he gave Polyphemus that name establishes Odysseus as one of the wiliest men in all of Western fiction. In fact, let me bring in the Butler translation to demonstrate more what I mean. Before even getting to that part of the tale, I think this statement by Odysseus to Alcinous on page 119, which goes to show the highly nonlinear nature of the story with 247 pages more to go, is fantastic. And Ulysses answered, King Alcinous, it is a good thing to hear a bard with such a divine voice as this man has. There is nothing better or more delightful than when a whole people make merry together, with the guests sitting orderly to listen, while the table is loaded with bread and meats, and the cupbearer draws wine and fills his cup for every man. Once he does get to one of the most famous scenes in all of literature, for as in the movie, the cyclops they encounter is not actually named, Butler writes on page 127 to 128 after the boulder is rolled in front of the cave, quote, "We lit a fire, offered some of the cheeses in sacrifice, ate others of them, and then sat waiting till the cyclops should come in with his sheep. When he came, he brought in with him a huge load of dry firewood to light the fire for his supper. And this he flung with such a noise to the floor of the cave that we hid ourselves for fear at the far end of the cavern. Meanwhile, he drove all the ewes inside, as well as the she-goats that he was going to milk, leaving the males, both rams and he-goats, outside in the yards. Then he rolled a huge stone to the mouth of the cave, so huge that 22 strong four-wheeled wagons would not be enough to draw it from its place against the doorway. When he had done so, he sat down and milked his ewes and goats, all in due course, and then let each of them have her own yen. He curdled half the milk and set it aside in wicker strainers, but the other half he poured into bowls that he might drink it for his supper. When he had got through with all his work, he lit the fire and then caught sight of us, whereon he said, 'Strangers, who are you? Where do you sail from? Are you traders, or do you sail the sea as rovers with your hands against every man, and every man's hand against you?' We were frightened out of our senses by his loud voice and monstrous form, but I managed to say, 'We are Achaeans on our way home from Troy, but by the will of Jove and stress of weather, we have been driven far out of our course. We are the people of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, who has won infinite renown throughout the whole world by sacking so great a city and killing so many people. We therefore humbly pray you to show us some hospitality, and otherwise make us such presents as visitors may reasonably expect. May your excellency fear the wrath of heaven, for we are your suppliants, and Jove takes all respectable travelers under his protection, for he is the avenger of all suppliants and foreigners in distress. To this he gave me but a pitiless answer. Stranger, said he, you are a fool, or else you know nothing of this country. Talk to me indeed about fearing the gods or shunning their anger. We cyclops do not care about Jove or any of your blessed gods, for we are ever so much stronger than they. I shall not spare either yourself or your companions out of any regard for Jove, unless I am in the humor of doing so. And now tell me where you made your ship fast when you came on shore. Was it round the point, or is she lying straight off the land? He said this to draw me out, but I was too cunning to be caught in that way. So I answered with a lie. Neptune, said I, sent my ship on to the rocks at the far end of your country and wrecked it. We were driven on to them from the open sea, but I and those who are with me escaped the jaws of death. The cruel wretch vouchsafed me not one word of answer, but with a sudden clutch, he gripped up 2 of my men at once and bashed them down upon the ground, as though they had been puppies. That's quite the image to leave off on. Before the graphic description of Polyphemus eating the 2 men and then falling asleep, due to the way Eumaeus was casually tossing puppies before Odysseus picked Argus in the movie. We are barely evolved apes who do not deserve the pure and unconditional love of doggos. Also, what an amazing performance by John Leguizamo, who, despite his best efforts, is still going to be typecast as Sid the Sloth when Ice Age Boiling Point thaws on February 5th, 2027. This is of a piece with Wikipedia explaining. God-fearing, suspicious, and scrupulous, Eumaeus delivers probably the oldest extant example of literary sarcasm when, after Odysseus offers a bargain entailing that he be thrown off a cliff should he lose, he answers, That would be virtuous of me, my friend, and good reputation would be mine among men, for present time alike and hereafter, if first I led you into my shelter, there entertained you as guest, then murdered you and ravished the dear life from you. Then cheerfully I could go and pray to Zeus, son of Kronos. Again, I digress. It makes Polyphemus more of a dumb animal to be only calling for his dad's name in Nolan's version, after everything that has happened. Odysseus is also essentially leading his men into a wild animal's den after a bag of said wild animal's cheese. Apparently the Cyclops invented feta, which he perhaps thought would reinforce the body horror of being eaten, but makes Odysseus even stupider than he was to lead his men there in the original story when the owner could be reasoned with at first. However, I can see how Nolan probably thought that Polyphemus being smart would have overheard the men whispering about their escape and nobody would have bought it as a result. He also likely wanted to increase Odysseus' moral culpability for breaking Zeus's law by reducing the agency, haughtiness, and aggression of Polyphemus. Having Polyphemus' conversation with the other Cyclopes, where he explains how nobody attacked him, could have destroyed the movie's pacing as well, which my co-host Kevin praises airtight, making the movie not feel 3 hours long, and to which I concurred. The problem with that is that even if people would have complained about the removal of the nobody sing, just the initial discussion passage I included, slimmed down for modern ears and viewing habits, would have been more than sufficient to establish Odysseus' trickster nature in the movie without wasting much time. The scene is also not clever as part of the film, the incredibly choppy nature of how it was edited because, though I picked up on this easily, and this is described more clearly on page 43 of the screenplay, there were not clear visual indicators that the first attempts at escape were coming from Odysseus' mind, analyzing the possibilities at first, muddling how Odysseus came up with it. This is especially disappointing, given that Nolan did amazing and innovative things that enhance the story. My favorite is hiring actual 7-foot giants to play the Laestrygonians, who were hinted to be cannibals by the elaborate wooden traps Odysseus' men are herded into. I'm not sure what the point of that armor is, though. And Devon Dalton as Matt Damon's stunt double, who stands 4'6". I'll always get a chuckle out of Matt Damon saying she has, quote, the greatest arms I've ever seen. Finding that out later was jaw-dropping because I had assumed Nolan was using forced perspective, which also would have been awesome.
Act 2, and ours is an age of silicon.
What does it mean to be civilized anyway? Speaking of awesome, even the splendid new kingdom of Egypt would think we were emissaries of Neith, the goddess of spiders, by creating such fantastical signs and wonders as the drone show over their great pyramids advertising Spider-Man Brand New Day. Bronze Age humans also had to invent a lot of curses from their gods, including Yahweh, who apparently just really hated people eating pork when he made pork himself, but originally was part of a pantheon and even had a wife. To explain natural diseases that humanity didn't discover the cause of until the 19th century, when tools were sufficiently advanced to enable one to see said causes smaller than the naked eye, and that mythology became unnecessary. That's how science marches on and continues to eat the lunch of organized religion when it comes to explanations of the natural world, leaving formalized theology in an increasingly smaller and smaller space to maneuver. However, Bronze Age monuments and history were amazing, and Bronze Age people were not stupid. Nor, as Nolan suggests, was the group of civilizations in about the late 13th century BCE instantaneously wiped out by sea peoples. While they were a contributing factor, and perhaps this is a necessary generalization to keep the movie, well, moving, to be accurate, I need you to close your eyes and picture the world that was lost. Most weapons, armor, and technology relies on a few minerals mined from a couple of far-off locations, necessitating a global network of trade that led to fabulous prosperity, at least for an elite. Two dominant superpowers circle each other over control of the key resources of the region and political control over the Levant, without being able to decisively defeat the other. Climate change causes agricultural productivity to drop, leading to depopulation of major cities, chaos, violence such as banditry, war, raids, and piracy, and mass migration that upends entire empires. If you're thinking of our own dependency on rare earth minerals, our own climate change, our own superpower rivalries between the US and China that make the Egyptians and Hittites look like kids playing in a sandbox, that is exactly my point. Again, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and in this case, the rhyme is at a scale that was unimaginable previously, so could have consequences on an unimaginable scale as well. By the way, that quote, often hilariously attributed incorrectly to Mark Twain, shows how people repeat similar patterns for good or ill because we haven't evolved all that long as distinct societies. Going by the invention of writing approximately 5,000 years ago, independently in ancient China, this Indus River Valley, and Sumer due to the necessity of record keeping for accurate management of grains, that isn't a lot of time we've been, quote, civilized. However, let's be generous and give agriculture maybe 10 or 12,000 years if you think that, for instance, the Natufians are a type of civilization due to having at least seasonal settlements despite their lacking a system of writing. This is of a piece with how the old copper culture in the prehistoric Midwest United States cold-worked deposits of bronze that appeared naturally in the hills and lakes of Michigan 3,000 years before the start of the Mediterranean Bronze Age in 3300 BCE and the Nordic Bronze Age in 2000 BCE had recognizable politics, canoes to harvest the bronze, trade routes, class systems, etc., without any writing either. Because reading is a skill that most of humanity has only been developing for 500 years since the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, we're also heading for our own post-literate world with techno-feudal bards and jesters explaining history to the masses. It's nerve-wracking to feel that, even though I'm deliberately jumping into the fray as a bard to try to help illuminate history for as many people as I can, before everything gets turned into a canticle for Leibowitz, and not a jester. Just because they didn't smelt does not make them prehistoric in the sense of idiotic. Even that estimate, though, is less than a tenth of the approximately 200,000 years that modern Homo sapiens have existed as a species separate from archaic humans, such as Homo erectus. During that time, we spent tens of thousands of years competing, violently murdering, and interbreeding with all of the rest of our hominid cousins, such as the hobbits of Flores, the Denisovans in East and Southeast Asia, the Neanderthals in Central Asia and across Europe, and the ghost hominids of West Africa, all of which have genetic expression in human DNA today, which might explain the origins of most mythological monsters and alien invasion stories, and whose evolution is covered in several excellent videos by one of my favorite science YouTubers, Northo2. So no wonder we humans keep stupidly repeating historical patterns despite scientists and historians being able to see them and screaming about them like Cassandra, who definitely would have killed the pacing to include. It's like poetry, it rhymes, as George Lucas would say, even though the Odyssey probably only rhymes in ancient Greek, if at all. To support my points, I'll be drawing upon the book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric H. Cline. He was spurred on to do this project back in 2020, as he explains in the introduction on page XV. Not sure how to say that. In early 2020, as I was working on the revision of this book, I saw a banner headline in The Guardian: Humanity under threat from perfect storm of crises. The world is facing a series of interlinked emergencies that are threatening the very existence of humans, wrote environmental correspondent Fiona Harvey. She was reporting on the results of a survey taken of 222 leading scientists from 52 countries. They had concluded that there are a number of principal emergencies facing us today: climate change with weather extremes, species loss, water scarcity, and a food production crisis. What was particularly worrisome, she said, is that the combination of all is amplifying the risks of each, creating a perfect storm that threatens to engulf humanity unless swift action is taken. I found that alarming, of course, Eric Cline continues, but also intriguing, for the contemporary situation that she describes has many similarities to 1177 BC. That was a time more than 3,000 years ago, when the Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations collapsed one after the other, changing the course of history. Clearly, calamitous collapses have happened before. Could it happen again? It's a question I've been asking since 2014, when the first edition of this book was published. I have long believed that the answer is yes. It's not a matter of if, but when. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit full force with devastating effects worldwide. Millions of people infected and hundreds of thousands dead. The full effects of this pestilence on top of the perfect storm of other stressors affecting our globalized world remains to be seen. But it is already clear that the future history of life on this planet will be changed, perhaps as fundamentally as life changed in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean regions some 3,200 years ago. Now, however, the changes that lie ahead are not limited to these areas, but are global in scope. In 1177 BC, Eric Cline re-examines the endless debate on this confederation of seafaring raiders and displaced populations who swept across the entire Eastern Mediterranean towards the end of the Late Bronze Age. Rather than viewing the Sea Peoples as a single monolithic army of ruthless invaders, modern archaeological consensus, as described by Cline, frames them as a complex mix of ethnic groups, mercenaries, and refugees driven by environmental and economic collapse. Egyptian records, most notably the inscriptions of Pharaoh Merneptah, circa 1208 BC, and Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, in circa 1177 BC, list specific named groups that comprise the Sea Peoples. From the very first page of the prologue, Cline describes them thusly. Quote, the Peliset, Djeker, Shekelesh, Shardana, Danuna, and Weshesh. Foreign-sounding names for foreign-looking people. We know little about them beyond what the Egyptian records tell us. We are not certain where the Sea Peoples originated. Perhaps in Sicily, Sardinia, and Italy, according to one scenario. Perhaps in the Aegean or Western Anatolia, or possibly even Cyprus or the Eastern Mediterranean. No ancient site has ever been identified as their origin or departure point. We think of them as moving relentlessly from site to site, overrunning countries and kingdoms as they went. According to the Egyptian texts, they set up camp in Syria before proceeding down the coast of Canaan, including parts of modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and into the Nile Delta of Egypt. Cline then goes on to say, according to Ramses' inscriptions, no country was able to oppose this invading mass of humanity. Resistance was futile. The great powers of the day, the Hittites, the Myceneans, the Canaanites, the Cypriots, and others, fell one by one. Some of the survivors fled the carnage, others huddled in the ruins of their once proud cities. Still others joined the invaders, swelling their ranks and adding to the apparent complexities of the mob of invaders. Each group of the Sea Peoples was on the move, each apparently motivated by individual reasons. Perhaps it was the desire for spoils or slaves that spurred some. Others may have been compelled by drought, famine, or population pressures to migrate from their own lands in the west. The exact quote he draws from is an inscription by Ramses at his mortuary temple of Medinet Habu in the Valley of the Kings, which states, quote, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Kate, the land of the Hittites, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alishaya on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Tjekir, Shekelesh, Danuna, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. The Laka are also notable to me as they were a very distinct culture from the dominant Hittites to the north and east, and the Ionian Greek colonies along the western shore of modern-day Turkey, and were a thorn in the side of both, and an influential naval power in their own right. Yet we know so little about them, or many Bronze Age empires that are otherwise mentioned by other cultures we do know about, such as the Median Empire, precisely due to this collapse erasing tens of thousands of records. Recent paleoclimate data from Stockholm University, as described by Archaeology News Online magazine, shows that climate change was in fact to blame. Quote, the study found this long drying trend came from slow changes in Earth's orbit around the sun. These orbital shifts reduced rainfall across much of the region over thousands of years. The pattern varied from place to place. The Levant became steadily drier, while parts of the Balkans and Anatolia held more moisture because cooler weather reduced water loss from soil and plants. The worst droughts appeared when long-term drying lined up with natural climate swings in the Atlantic Ocean and atmosphere. Those shifts worked across time spans ranging from centuries to thousands of years. When several of those cycles peaked together, rainfall dropped far below normal across land already short of water. Lead author Catherine Powers said that the strongest droughts formed when several natural climate cycles aligned. Their combined effect created far harsher dry periods than the long-term trend produced on its own. There's also this map showing the trends of decreasing brown and increasing green rainfall at the time. Pretty much everywhere on it except for sub-Saharan Africa is brown, and the caption explains it such. Quote, the eastern Mediterranean dried as part of a broader climate transition. Weakening monsoons and shifting atmospheric circulation reduced moisture from Africa and rainfall across the region. Credit Catherine Powers, Stockholm University. This suggests, as Cline does, that starvation and famine across the Aegean, Western Anatolia, and the Black Sea region pushed whole populations out of their homelands. That relief at Medinet Habu that shows Ramses' decisive victories at the battles of Djahi and of the Delta in approximately 1175 BCE that narrowly saved the new kingdom of Egypt from destruction also show the sea peoples traveling not just in warships, but with heavy arx carts carrying women, children, and household goods, which is a clear indicator of mass migration rather than simple banditry or military conquest. Archaeologists have also noted similarities between Aegean material culture and the artifacts left by groups like the Peliset, and after their defeat, they and the Tjekir ended up settling in the land the Egyptians would have called Canaan, for as you have seen, they ruled it for some time. The more empires change, the more they stay the same, and forming the Philistine Pentapolis of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. That was the Great Iron Age rifle to Israel, which is named by a non-biblical source for the first time in the Mernataf stele in Luxor. Quote, together with three other defeated states in Canaan, Gezer, Yanoam, and Ashkelon. The hieroglyphic symbols used designate a foreign people group as opposed to a city, as the words for Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam are marked, suggesting that in the late 12th century, Israel had achieved a specific identity as a people, but had not yet developed into a fixed political entity or state. Still, this reinforces my point made over 3 videos passionately discussing the subject, on the side of human rights for all, and that's it, that Israeli Jews and Arab Palestinians are both groups of Canaanites with deep roots in the region and an equal right of self-determination there. Many scholars, including Cline, highlight that events surrounding the legendary Trojan War, circa 1200 BC, fit into this broader disruption across Western Anatolia and Greece, triggering a wave of Aegean displacement across the Mediterranean, and that this fits with the 6th of 9 archaeological layers of Troy, with the 9th being established directly on top of the ruins of Troy 8, after its destruction by the Roman general Gaius Flavius Fimbria in 85 BCE. Earthquakes in the late 5th to early 6th century CE caused extensive damage, collapsing many of the major public structures. Rebuilding during the Byzantine period was limited, and much of the city lay in ruins. Nevertheless, archaeological evidence, including late Byzantine ceramics, small domestic structures, and modifications to earlier buildings, indicates that a reduced population continued to inhabit parts of the citadel and surrounding slopes. By the end of the Byzantine period, the site's occupation had contracted scattered small-scale settlements. The information in that quote comes from the website Stratigraphic Phases of Ancient Troy by the Madain Project that describes itself as Explore Abrahamic History and Archaeology, 2,700 plus articles, 31,000 plus images, 181 plus authorities, 10,000 plus points of interest, 140 plus publications. And they describe Troy 6 thusly. Troy 6, circa 1750 to 1300 BCE, was a major fortified city whose citadel stood on a series of rising terraces, the outermost still well preserved, lined with freestanding multi-story elite houses that blended megaron layouts. Minoan Mycenean style palaces with a great central hall, supporting my thinking that Troy was established in 3000 BCE on less than 1 hectare of land, but as a Ionian Greek colony. Put a pin in my mention of palaces as well. With irregular plans, and showed both local and Aegean influences, a royal palace may have crowned the highest terrace, though later classical construction removed most traces. Its massive limestone ashlar walls, built in a distinctive sawtooth style, and sloping like those at Hattusa, expanded over time to 5 meters thick and more than 9 meters high, punctuated by rectangular watchtowers with 5 gates, some bearing non-functional pillars interpreted as religious symbols, leading into paved and drained streets. South of the citadel lay a 30-hectare lower town, defended by a rock-cut ditch and possibly a palisade, with dense neighborhoods, industrial areas producing goods such as murex dyed tiles, and agricultural installations. This settlement, only identified in the late 1980s, made Troy 6 over 16 times larger than previously thought. The city's material culture reflects a distinct northwestern Anatolian tradition, centered on wheel-made tanware and Anatolian grey ware derived from earlier Minion traditions, evolving from Aegean to Anatolian forms by 1700 BCE, and supplemented by imported and locally imitated Minoan, Mycenean, Cypriot, and Levantine wares. Notable absences include Hittite artifacts, large-scale sculpture, and wall painting, though horses appear here for the first time. The spoken language remains unknown, with Luwian considered plausible based on a seal in Anatolian hieroglyphs, and indirect Hittite textual references suggesting literacy and a now-lost archive in the citadel's innermost precinct. The city met its end around 1300 BCE, Troy 6H, in an event most likely caused by an earthquake, evidenced by collapsed masonry and subsidence. Though alternative theories include civil unrest or attack, neither supported by signs of burning or casualties. Then comes Troy 7A, built soon after the destruction of Troy 6 around 1300 BCE, appears to have been established by survivors who reused much of this earlier city's infrastructure, including the citadel walls, which were reinforced with additional stone towers and mud brick breastworks. The citadel grew crowded with new small houses, while the lower city expanded beyond its earlier extent. Large storage jars, pithoi, buried in floors suggest preparations for siege or stockpiling. Material culture shows continuity with Troy 6, though foreign imports declined. The city met its end circa 1180 BCE, in a destruction layer marked by scorch marks and evidence of enemy attack, placing it in the wider context of the late Bronze Age collapse. This is also a very common naming scheme for layers of cities in archaeological digs, such as Cline's description on page 111 of David Usiskin, a Tel Aviv University archaeologist and the recently retired co-director of the Megiddo expedition, who suggested that there were not 2 palaces at Megiddo, but a single 2-story palace, renovated slightly during the transition from 7B to 7A about 1200 BCE. I hope that illuminates the process archaeologists go through to figure this stuff out, even if only in a small part. Naturally, seeing multiple destruction layers at around the same time is a huge clue that this collapse was sudden, even if its causes were centuries in the making. One important thing that can be inferred from all this as well is that this is one of many times that the greatest epics of history, alongside Gilgamesh and Sundayata, was likely filtering real events through memory. I promise I am not trying to be condescending here, but this is what I believe myth is, while history and science does its best to correct that memory in a disorganized way that has excluded a lot of voices in the past, and that is only improving recently. Back to the myth we're analyzing today, then. I will give the Odyssey a lot of credit for showing something similar to the Medinet Habu stele, albeit with just men, in this scene from page 36 of the screenplay. Exterior, Odysseus' ship, day. Odysseus and Eurylochus watch a lush shore come into view. Odysseus, see? Eurylochus, lucky bastard. We're down to our last supplies. Odysseus turns to another one of his men, Polytice. Odysseus, assemble a landing party, food and water, enough for 3 weeks. Polytice, what if they won't give it? Eurylochus, how badly do you want to go home? Odysseus, in voiceover. Begging, trading, or plundering. Exterior coastal village, twilight. Eurylochus interrogates a kneeling old man. Men carry sacks and jars down to the sea. A soldier, Elpenor, translates. Odysseus, Vio, depending on our needs. Eurylochus, ask him why they abandoned their village instead of welcoming us. Elpenor, he says they thought we were the sea people. Eurylochus crouches to look the old man in the eye. Eurylochus, no, we're Greeks, from Ithaca. Maybe you heard of our victory at Troy? Nothing. We're heading west on the southerly winds. Nothing. Eurylochus rises. The old man starts talking. Elpenor, he says if we go that way, we won't like the things we'll find. Eurylochus nods at Polytice, who puts a torch to a thatched roof. Odysseus, Vio. After years of war, Eurylochus heads back to shore amongst his plundering men. Odysseus, Vio. No one can stand between my men and home. Interior, Calypso's cave, night. Odysseus, not even me. However, where I would have liked Nolan to show just a smidge more of the actual causes of the calamity is with visual reference to the Mycenean palatial economy. This was a complex system, as you'll see from the graph on screen, but it essentially boiled down to people donating a portion of their resources to the palace in taxes, who then pooled and redistributed them to potentially both support elite consumption and hedge against famine for ordinary people. The article, The Mycenean Palatial Economy, Making the Most of the Gaps in the Evidence from 1993 by Paul Halstead, which you can read for free here by registering for a JSTOR account, along with 99 other articles a month, states, quote, it has been argued that the Mycenaean palace is practiced as an extreme form of staple finance. Each commodity was separately collected and redistributed, with no evidence that obligations in one commodity could be paid in another. The book chapter, The Mycenaean Tablets and Economic History by M.I. Finley from 1957 also explains how we know so much about this time period. Quote, in June 1952, Michael Ventris made the unexpected discovery that the language of the clay tablets written in the Linear B script was Greek. The earliest Greek writing was thus pushed back more than half a millennium to the period roughly 1400 to 1200 BC. The redistribution part is shown by the invitation of beggars to each feast, as is the breakdown of it by the suitors' excessive consumption that parallels the excessive consumption of billionaires sucking out the marrow of a damaged American government's bones. So it's not like that theme of economic inequality isn't there. However, without showing how climate change lowered productivity, it's a little limp. It doesn't even have to take one of Nolan's preferred exposition dumps to do so. You just need to have a procession of farmers delivering the food to the palace that gets smaller and smaller over time. That's the thing about trying to tell everything about this massive poem and its universe in a 3-hour movie, though. Or even what I estimate as I close in on the end of this video will be an approximately hour and a half video. It's just too massive to fit everything, so you have to adapt and choose what's important to the story you're trying to tell. Summations of history and comparisons between ancient and modern day are always like this. Though I'm unnerved by his constant glazing of both Julius Caesar and Rome as the greatest civilization or whatever, I do get the thrust of the video by Philosophical Gamer that Julius Caesar implemented far more aggressive social policies than even today's most democratic socialist politicians like Mondani, such as giving every Roman 2,000 sesterces of rent remittances for a year, effectively making it free, distributing 500 sesterces per person to every other town in Italy, and establishing the Cura Annone, a state-run program for distributing free food, also known as the dole. Key weakness, though, is of course that per core periphery theory, Rome's dole relied on regular imports of grain from colonial territory in Carthage. Once Rome's greatest enemy until it was burned to the ground, its people genocidally massacred or sold into slavery, Control of the city enabled the city of Rome to receive free bread, oil, and even pork until the Vandals conquered the city in 439 and truly rang the death bell for the tax revenues of a Western Roman Empire that had been fighting back against disintegration for nearly 200 years, even though that bell would not stop tolling until 480, in my opinion, with the East surviving and becoming the Byzantine Empire due to more secure control of granaries in Egypt. This means that I think socialism in a post-market economy, which is difficult due to the many benefits of market economies, among them the benefits of paying for one commodity with another, this problem eventually led to the invention of currency as a medium of neutral exchange, should work more like the Mycenean palatial economy, where those who have are required to give a fair share of the resources, and then the government takes care of redistribution. I think Marx would approve. I'll delve more into all that in History Flights number 16, Why I Write About Empires, which will also philosophically reflect on my fascination with Star Wars' Galactic Empire, the Byzantine Empire since middle school, and steampunk since 2019. So if you've made it this far, please be sure to like and subscribe for more historical tours of video games. Still, this podcast has been by necessity itself a very broad overview of specific parts of the Odyssey and surrounding context that is sometimes focused on my sense of personal marooning and strength in the face of raids on my own life as our own world teeters on a Bronze Age collapse of its own. So while you still can, while you still have a non-rotted brain to use, know that neither this History Flights podcast, nor any YouTuber, Christopher Nolan, Emily Wilson, Samuel Butler, or any translator should tell you what the Odyssey, or the Iliad, or the history of the Bronze Age collapse, or any part of history of literature should mean. Read it for yourself. This is precisely why Nolan closes the movie with this haunting, if a bit highfalutin, warning at the end of the screenplay. Odysseus, VO. We broke the fragile bonds between men, and for centuries of darkness to follow, the stories of Troy will only be sun. Odysseus. Telemachus will be king, and will head into the unknown west to honor my men together. Bang! Insert cut, pushing low through waves at sunset. She smiles at him. Penelope, take your fastest ship and brightest crew and head for the horizon? Odysseus nods. Odysseus, chasing the escaping sun. Exterior ship, evening. As the ship rows west, Penelope and Odysseus stand at the front, looking to the warming horizon. Penelope, why will the stories only be sun? Odysseus, because songs will be all they have to remember those of us who could write. Penelope looks at Odysseus, takes his hands in hers. Penelope, civilization will rise again. Odysseus thinks, nods. Exterior Troy, night. Odysseus stumbles in the flaming ruins of Troy, breathing hard on one knee. Sweating in the firelight, he looks up, appalled. Odysseus, VO, a new dawn will break over the darkened world. The vast wooden horse, aflame, listing sickly, falls sideways, smoke and flame trailing. Odysseus, VO, and our mistakes will once again be forgotten. The horse jams against the temple of Athena, burning, and we fade out, credits, end. Reading and writing literature and studying history were the province of the elites for thousands of years because of the power structures and intensive training required to do so. The struggle to democratize religion, political understanding, and historical knowledge has been ongoing since the invention of the printing press, which, while invented in the West along with ideas of separation of religion and state, could not be contained to it. Between those who would rather sit in a fancy palace, or a mosque, or a temple, or a church, or a corporate boardroom and gorge themselves and continually contribute carbon, hoard money they can't possibly spend in a lifetime, and break Zeus's law while treating the masses as a permanent class of helots by just making everything more expensive and controlling our entertainment by killing physical media and pitting us against each other over distinctions such as queer and straight, Jew and Arab, civilized and sea people in a divide and conquer process that I call team sportification, so that we don't storm the palaces and demand they share food that isn't even theirs with us. You know why they do this? Unlike the Bronze Age, when the otherwise complex people of the Mediterranean cosmopolitan sphere at the time could not possibly have known that the Earth orbited the Sun, knowledge has democratized. Science is easy to access and look up, which has contributed to a decline in religiosity worldwide and a softening of hateful religious attitudes, as well as momentum for clean energy. Yet some people will always benefit from economic inequality, from racial hatred, from shallow and fundamentalist religious prejudice, from sitting pretty in palaces across oceans while Troy burns and the rest of us helots with it. So, knowing that if people bothered to really independently investigate the truth for themselves, that they're toast, these weasels muddle the waters of information with AI slop, sue and defund the museums, science foundations, and media organizations trying to help, try to steal our elections with transgender people and immigrants as scapegoats, declare themselves gods, bomb people thousands of miles away for no rational reason, break all bonds between men, so that they are the only ones left when the Silicon Age collapses, and we are forced to listen to them in the rubble and worship the artificial and general intelligence gods they are so desperately sacrificing people to gain the favor of. Then they will become minor gods of the Palantir pantheon, and kings and priests, and evolve into Homo superior, discarding what they believe to be the evolutionary flaw of empathy and community while treating us as slaves. That's why I keep coming back to Andrew Ryan's defiant declaration in Bioshock just as you're about to whack him with a golf club. A man chooses, a slave obeys. Obey! That's why you need to read. Not just listen to audiobooks, though that is still reading. Read. Take the time, even just 15 minutes a day. If you don't have the time, demand that society make the time for leisure, just like how unions in the 19th century demanded an 8-hour workday. Rational policy and an understanding of history can still fix this. A 4-day weekend, sovereign fund taxing AI companies that they're really going to take all our jobs. Regulations on algorithms, including on-device cryptography, meaning not showing your ID to a website, for age verification to protect our youngest, most impressionable minds from being rotted. All of these are reasonable ideas the government should be exploring, but isn't right now. I, on the other hand, do rather too much of one type of reading and not the other. It's difficult to entirely avoid doom scrolling since I am fighting in a metaphorical battlefield for the Constitution, and to support my family across the sea while I work at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is currently in the middle of an illegal return to office maneuver to try to pressure me and other civil servants that Russell vote disfavors into quitting. However, while I've had phases of reading mainly nonfiction, there have been months sometimes these past few years where I've struggled to find the emotional energy to read a book. Sometimes the thing you need the most is the hardest to initiate because feeling leaden and numb from all the trauma I read about in the news every day, and even making videos to try to cut through the noise, which necessitates me processing a lot of noise, feels like the main thing I can do that makes a difference, but is also exhausting. Since it wasn't entirely in the muck of current day politics, being spurred to read The Odyssey for this review, and so many other related things after the movie rekindled a drive to escape through reading, for me, was really helpful. Instead of just reading to survive or even to educate. So, I'll take one last quote from page 120 of the screenplay to reflect on my own odyssey to be reunited that I'm still in the middle of but will hopefully end soon. Exterior beach outside Calypso's cave, day. Odysseus straps the planks of his crude raft together. Calypso, Vio, you are a man who needs to control his fate, but you cannot control this. He pulls it down to the shore. Calypso, Vio, you must give yourself to the storm, give yourself to Poseidon, take your punishment. Pushes it out onto the waves. Calypso watches. Calypso, Vio, Zeus won't let him, meaning Poseidon, kill you. Exterior raft, day. Odysseus lies back on the raft, staring at the sky, riding the swell, drifting as the sea rises. Calypso, Vio, give up the fight, give up control, and live. It's a leap of faith you've never yet made, Odysseus. Close on Odysseus as he clings to the raft, water streaming across him, endlessly, drowning, clearly drowning. Insert cut, a bronze sword decapitates a stone statue of Athena, sparking, the head tumbling in flickering firelight. It comes to rest on filthy marble, rocking from side to side as if shaking her head. Exterior foggy beach, dawn. Odysseus lies on his back, staring up at the sky. I don't think I can entirely give up that side of me that demands the world change. I never will, because it's exactly what makes me DC Shepard. What makes me a journalist. What makes me the wrath of history. I will not be silenced by anyone as I fight for truth, justice, and historical accuracy, which really is the study of how people have told history and adapted it and contradicted each other, and what can be read in between the facts rather than just a set of facts everyone clings to. Yet as history changes, so must I. Over these next couple of months, because I am anticipating doing more in-person work, I'm trying to find ways to make this video production hobby less intense. I'm already making one of my 3 podcasts, The Hidden Faith, a truly independent investigation of the Baha'i faith, sporadically, less angrily, and while I have a couple of lost episodes of that scheduled, I am looking into how to record live streams of Sunny Redemption sailing with consistent quality so that I'm not breaking my back every 2 weeks with editing these videos as well. I also am only doing the Hidden Faith when I feel like I can contribute something unique to the conversation around that little-known religion. And I feel that it has, such as shining a new light on the legal issues of Justin Baldoni with fellow creators Dale Husband and Go Do Your Own Research, or helping one of the anonymous Baha'is I interviewed last year to resign. My plan is I will casually interview the YouTuber LGBTQ Baha'i Experience in the next few weeks, then make that my September History Flights number 15. They have crossed over a couple times before. Then record a more off-the-cuff and personal video for number 16, Why I Write About Empires, that same time, and schedule its upload in October. I'm doing this so I can buy myself a couple of months to try to read less news, read more books, play more games by myself and with one of my closest friends and Kevin for fun instead of for news. Then live stream, and all the while take the next 4 months to return to writing my novel, The Wind Empress in Their Majesty's Service, to try to process my feelings about injustice in the world more metaphorically. I will also be slowly researching the next video in The Empire of Many Lives, the Byzantine Empire's OP geography, for like January, with as much time between episodes as necessary to make sure each episode's quality in that series improves. Because rushing to try to gain algorithmic fame is the ultimate Trojan horse for my and any content creator's mental health. My goal is to still make monthly history flights, but have the ones that are not focused on the Byzantine Empire be more off-the-cuff political speeches, depending on the state of the country, that I furiously write about in a single evening instead of doing historical research every month, like I'm running out of time, and micromanaging every aspect of this channel by myself. Thank you for taking this history flight with me through the Odyssey. Make this excellent movie a jumping-off point for your own Odyssey into reading more history and fiction. I hope you rest easier too, having learned some history.